So first, let me thank the Faculty of Public Affairs for sponsoring this event, for giving me the research prize, the Dean, Andre Plort, and the Associate Dean, Karen, that introduced this seminar, but also the media group that has been wonderful, Karen, Cassie, Leonardo. And I think it's important because we do research and we do research very isolated. I go to Bolivia and come back, nobody knows what I do. And I think this type of events really help us to connect to a broader public and to our colleagues. So I thank Hans Martin and our PhD student, Eje, that will talk, but also our outside visitors, Janet and Mario. And the students that are here, my colleagues. So it's very important for me to be sharing this moment with you. So thank you very much to be here. So I am going to do is to think about these concepts, and Hans Martin did a great job, so you facilitate my presentations, and apply them to the politics of territoriality in the transition to pluriverse, and use the case of Bolivia, that is where I am doing research. So maybe a map of Bolivia here, for those of you that are not familiar. I am going to see Bolivia as geographically divided in two main parts. One is the lowlands, that is this part in green, when I am going to focus mainly, and this part here that is the Andean regions, the highland. La Paz is here, the capital, and here are other two cities that I am going to talk about, maybe Trinidad. Now, this division is not only geographical, but also when talking about indigenous groups is very important, because in Bolivia there are 33 nations, indigenous nations, and in the year 2001, that I am going to talk about that period, 62% of the population in Bolivia self-identified as indigenous. In the lowland, there were 22 pueblos, different languages, and they are very tiny proportion of the population, only 5% of the population. The two major indigenous groups are mainly, at that time also, were mainly in the Altiplano, are the Quechuas and the Aymaras. There are more than 50% of the population. Now, using Hans Martin language, what I am interested is because in the 1990s, indigenous from the lowland initiated and very important marches going from the lowland to the capital of Bolivia. This, the first march was in 1990, 600 men and women marched for 60 days, and the title of the march was For Territory and Dignity. This march, we think in terms of 635 kilometers, is not much. It's almost like going south of Toronto, more or less. But if you think going from the lowlands to the El Alto, it was a huge thing. And it was really a performance, a demonstration that they did. Now, all these marches, there was another in 1996 called Territory Development and Political Participation, another in 2000, and another in 2002. You will see how the territory was at the center of these marches. One of the banners said, "We don't want land, we want territory." And I think that this banner expressed the main idea of what they were doing with this march. It was to change the concept, the modern concept of land, that is very anthropocentric, into a concept of a relationship between humans and non-humans. That is very important for indigenous groups, as Marisol de la Cadena will say, between humans and earth beings. So for them, life is co-produced between these two. There is not a separation like in Western modernity. And secondly, they initiated what Mario Blaser called an ontological negotiation. So they really interrupted the modern concept of territory and went into a negotiation between the life's words and opening the possibility of a pluriversal politics. So to understand the importance of territory, like Hans Martin, we go to the Bruno Latour, what he called the great modern divides, that are two. One between nature and culture, so nature is separated from culture, and the non-modern and separated from the modern. And in my view, indigeneity is exactly at the middle of these two divides. Even more, I think we cannot understand the divide without the concept of indigeneity. So they are exactly at the content on that. And that's why my first use of the concept of indigeneity is a concept from political ontology that I take from Marisol de la Cadena. And she said that it's a relation in concept that emerged between nothing and what sees as everything, but that this nothing exceeds what is declared everything. So just to give an example about the right to territory that is central to this presentation. In general, the moderns are the ones that understand as having everything, while the indigenous are the ones that do not have anything, they have nothing. So if we look at in terms of the concept of territory and look at where the modern concept emerged, it was generally that the moderns were thought of themselves as the one that could differentiate nature from culture. And they call, for example, the territory, I'm talking about the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, time of Hobbes and political philosophy. So they saw America and also parts of Africa and Australia, etc., as vacant land, empty land, or terra nullis, that is called. And so for them, they were the ones, because they differentiated nature from culture, they were the ones that have the right to that territory. And also, they apply, and I think it was the first step to thinking of the universe of one. Why they thought of the universe of one? Because for them was very important that their rights will apply to indigenous groups. So we differentiated nature from culture. When they came to America, so the savage cannot differentiate that, so we are going to take their land because we can provide more efficiently and in terms of our needs. So in that sense, as Arturo Escobar says, the moderns arrogated themselves the right to be the world. And indigenous and all the other people were nothing. So in that sense, when we look at the concept of state of nature of Hobbes, is exactly that. Indigenous are nothing. They don't have territory. They don't have industry. Their life is short. And, nasty and brutish, thank you, yes. So they, because they are so close to nature, say they cannot use of land, and they justify the dispossession of their land on that principle. And in this case, it was not only indigenous, also women were separated from a territory, and also women were part of the enclosure. It was not only an enclosure of territory, but there was also an enclosure of knowledge and an enclosure of certain activities. So women activities, productive activities were considered non-work, so indigenous women, or women in general, were put also at the service of men. And women were also even an status inferior to men and to indigenous, because in general they were considered even non-human. So these ideas went on and on for centuries. I can give you several examples. I am going to focus in one, in my view, recent example. I know some of the young people doesn't know about the 1950s, but in the 1950s, there was a very important revolution in Bolivia. It was a very progressive revolution, the 1952 revolution. It was Marxist-inspired revolution. And for these revolutionaries that were centered on land, on land redistribution, they did a very important agrarian reform. Indigenous didn't count. So the perception of the division of the perceptible, let's say, they divided indigenous in two groups. One, the one from the highland, and they called them not indigenous. Say, from now on, you cannot be called indigenous. From now on, you are going to be called peasants. And disappear even the word indigenous. And all the organization of the indigenous groups were called trade unions. So there was no more ILUs, or any other organization. There were only trade unions. And what happened with the indigenous of the lowlands? They didn't count, they couldn't even think of them as subjects of policy or contribute anywhere. So if we take one of the articles of the law of agrarian reform, they say forest people. They were called forest people. That is, they were still in the 1950s closer to nature. So forest people in savage condition and with primitive organization will remain under the protection of the state. So they didn't count. And even more, the program of agrarian reform declared again the land of indigenous people as vacant land. And so they, in their policy, they increased the migration of indigenous from the highland to the lowland. And my first, when I went to Bolivia to do this research for the first time, when I talked with indigenous from the lowland, they say, the colonizers. And for me, colonizers, the European. No? And so it didn't make sense to me. So I asked my research assistant after I left, who are the colonizers? And she told me, the Aymaras and the Quechuas from the lowland. So you will see how the identities of these indigenous will change according to the policies and some of the policies of the state. With the neoliberal names, this pressure of migrations to the lowland was even bigger because all the unemployment created by neoliberal policies. And a group of them, very important group of them, were to the lowland and to cultivate coca. Practically, there are several, but we can talk of two big life projects. The indigenous from the lowland that have lived in there forever, and the cocaleros that was indigenous immigrants. Now, and that's my point when I talk about the march of the 1990s, is that they really, with the march and with their activities, they interrupted the concept of territory. And I am going to use the sentence of one of them, said, we are marching to the head of government so that they see that we live here, that we have our own government and capacity to distinguish and define our issues. So they were not asking for different interests. They were asking recognition for their existence. They were saying, we exist here and we have our own government. So that was a very important way to breaking and interrupting the concept that they were of no account. But also, and I think that's another important concept of political ontology, is that when we think about modernity, we are always thinking about dichotomies. You are either this or that. You are civilized or not civilized. You are indigenous or you are modern. So in that sense, like in the agrarian reform of 1953, there are only two alternatives left. You are assimilated, that is the main of the policies of assimilation, or you are keeping a reserve, you are different, you are keeping there. part of the approach of political ontology that I think is also part of Janet Conway when she looks at the social movements and that, is that there is possibility that there is a convergence of diversity, that different indigenous groups can get together with feminists, with ecologists, with environmentalists, anti-globalizations, whenever it is, and get together because they are not isolated, they are not outside, as Marisol de la Cadena said. They are there, and there is an excess. From that excess is that they can connect the two worlds. So they always have engaged, but I think in the latest part, I think they were more successful in entering in negotiations, bringing the entities that they make the particular work. In this case, they are making visible their own ontology. And they form with other indigenous, with trade unions, with peasants, what it was called an unity pact, wrote a draft of the constitutions, and also changing the constitutions to levels that were not imagined under modernity. For example, the concept of plurinational state, and I can use a lot of math. I don't have too much time, so I am going to go very fast now. Now, the other important thing about these partial connections is that it's not an academic proposal. On the contrary, they talk from their place, from their own experience, and in reactions to the policies from the neoliberal or from the policies from the Marxist government, and is about their own experience on their own bodies. And also they make marches as spaces of connections. Another indigenous said, marches are like loose ideas similar to a flag. We have to think here the indigenous flag that is called the Wipala, that is all interconnections, to systematize loose ideas and how this proposal has to be consolidated with other indigenous. So there is a politics that is different than the politics of representation when only the enlightened, the political parties can participate. That is a place, a type of politics. But again, and I think it's important, I'm going to do another big jump here, we can discuss more about that, is that this way of looking at politics from a political ontology also avoids essentialisms, that because they are indigenous are good or because they are indigenous are successful or that. But rather what we can learn from the process in Bolivia is that it's a process without guarantees. So despite the constitutions and the rights of the Pachamama, everything progressive that is a nature being in the Constitution, despite all these things, in 2008, the indigenous president, exactly, we cannot think about essentialist way of being a president, Evo Morales, signed an agreement with a Brazilian company to build a road in the middle of the national park, what is called Timnis, and without negotiating consensus from indigenous constitution, how it was written and ratified in the constitutions. This originated another march, it's called the 8th March, when 1,000 indigenous went from the same area that they departed in 1990 to the center of La Paz. They were able to halt the construction of the road. Still, at this moment, it's uncertain if it's going to be built or not. But what I want to finish is that, no, I have 2 things to say more. How much I have? 3 minutes, okay. Is that even in this process, and I am going to use the case of the Vice President Álvaro García Linera, after this march, he wrote a book called The Geopolitics on the Amazon. And in this book, he mainly go back to the concepts of the 17th century. And he really, in that book, from my perspective, he take away all the things that indigenous have said and done in order to be counted. For example, and this is only an example, we can discuss more, how he said for him, the indigenous in the Amazon, they are totally colonized. They cannot talk by themselves. The NGOs are the ones that talk by them. And so they say they are unable to constitute in a counterpower to the system of the landowner system. So they ignore totally all these agencies and all these hundreds of centuries of being able to negotiate. But, and I think that's another part of Bolivia that is very important, is that history, they tend to take all these defeats, if we can call it, and bring it into more politics. And I think that's the essence of politics. It's a struggle between wars. So in the middle of this march in 2011, indigenous women from the highlands were concerned what happened to the indigenous women from the lowlands. And they created several vigils in La Paz and in other regions, and created a public space. And I think for the indigenous movement in Bolivia, it was a very, very important moment of subjectification, of being able to participate in politics, to form their own organizations. And the other important thing is that it's not only local, that this is not only a place-based politics, it's also local, but it's also global. And now they are increasing the participation with other indigenous women. That's a meeting that I participated in 2013 in Popayán in Colombia, where they have a huge network of indigenous women in the Andes region, and even in solidarity with indigenous from Central America, and even from Canada, where the issue of territory is also very, very important. And also they have worked and created a local group called Chimpu, that's the indigenous woman, Toribia that I work in Bolivia, and that I own her a lot of the few things that I have learned on Bolivia. That is recovering their policies, their knowledge, their way of work. So in that sense, and just a final thought, is that especially in terms of political science and political disciplines, what I can see that is happening is that really we have to rethink how much our concepts in political, how much our concepts in political science are able to really establish a conversation with indigenous women. And I think for that we have to provincialize our knowledge, our understanding of what is politics, and how we can respond to that. So thank you.